Most Christmas songs or carols seem to be about joy, peace and love in some form. And yet, in the reality of the busyness of Christmas and the inevitable proximity of the extended family, it can make it one of the most emotionally challenging times of year. As we head into the relational trials and opportunities of the Christmas celebrations, let's remind ourselves that Christmas can produce rather than compromise love for others. Today's reflection will think of a few different headings and how we can accomplish that. First of all, we can look to the interests of others. The first Christmas began in the heart of God, in the mind of Christ. Paul tells the Christians in Philippians 2:5, think the same way that Christ Jesus thought. And he continues, Jesus did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. What mindset gave rise to that first Christmas? Not the impulse to cling to private rights and privileges as God, but the willingness to inconvenience himself, to sacrifice comfort and become human. Instead of grasping the privilege, Jesus emptied himself of his rights. There is a call of love, and it begins with a call to look to the interests of others, to get outside our own needs and our own preferences, to look beyond ourselves and to not just see, but to seek to meet the needs of others. How our Christmases might be transformed if we were to genuinely look to the interests of others rather than be focused on trying to recreate that perfect Christmas experience that we see on our television sets, that we see in the films, or that we have some warped memory of. The next thing is that we should gladly spend and be spent. Having been freed from the prison of self to see the interests of others, what do? How do we go about meeting the needs of others? Paul's insight into love in 2 Corinthians 12:15 is powerful, and particularly so for Christmas. So I will gladly give all that I have and all that I am. Will you love me less for loving you too much? Is how the CEV puts it. The English Standard Version says this: I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? Paul's fatherly care didn't always feel like loving to the Corinthian church. And here he implores them not to turn their hearts from him, but to see that he really does love them. And what evidence is there of Paul's love? Well, it's the fact that he will most gladly spend and be spent for their souls. Paul will embrace costly and inconvenient personal losses for their gain. Paul will give his time, energy, attention, possessions, money, comfort, peace of mind in order to benefit them. And he doesn't do it begrudgingly, but rather gladly. Because in the words of Jesus, more blessing comes from giving than from receiving. The next thing is to remember the great possession. What we've said so far is easier said than done. In our sin, we so easily default to the selfishness and self-focus rather than looking to the interests of others. So how do we keep loving even when it's hard? Hebrews 10:32-34 recalls a time when some in the early church were put in prison for their faith. And others, instead of going into hiding, went publicly to visit their friends in prison. In doing so, they exposed themselves to the same persecution. Their possessions were plundered by official decree or mob violence. Hebrews 10:34 reminds them, "You gladly let your possessions be taken away." Not only did they accept what was happening, but they did it with joy. Where did this joy come from? Well, the answer is at the end of verse 34. It says this: "Because you knew you had something better, something that would last forever." Because those Christians had God as the heavenly treasure, they were able to accept the loss of their earthly treasures or their possessions in the calling of love. And not just accept it, but to joyfully accept. They joyfully accepted the loss of their finite, limited possessions because they knew they had an infinite, heavenly, all-satisfying, singular possession whose name is Jesus. If such joy in the great possession could strengthen them to endure all that they suffered and lost, how much more might it inspire genuine love and generosity in us at Christmas? So not just giving our money and material possessions as gifts, but also giving our treasured possession, our time, our energy, the comfort that we have, inconveniencing ourselves and giving people our attention. The next thing is that we should remember. The knowing will make a difference when it comes to the call of love. Not just having that great possession who is God himself, but remembering that we have him. You knew you had something better, something that would last forever. And such knowing makes it possible for us to share the true joy of Christmas, which is not selfish, but sacrificial. It is a sacrificial joy. When we enjoy God and his Son as our great possession, we are finally free to surrender our small private enjoyment for the great enjoyment of meeting the needs of others and then pointing them in the direction of that treasure that we have, which is Jesus. The call to look to the interests of others, to gladly spend and be spent, to remember the better and abiding possession is not a call to give up true Christmas joy, but the opposite, to truly taste the depths and delight that God himself came to bring.